Hey everybody, welcome back to the Gray Fox Latin Teacher Podcast. My name is Andrew and I am here with Costas. Hi Costas.
Hola mis amigos.
I think we've got someone who made it to the wrong podcast today.
Did I walk into the wrong podcast again?
Yeah, I think that's the next one down the hall. This is the Latin Teacher Podcast.
Well, we'll just have to make do, I guess.
I think you mean salvete amici, probably.
I do indeed, yes. Salvete amici.
Salvete. And today we are going to be talking about teaching Latin declension endings. Now, that is you might not think that we can fill an hour talking about that, but I promise you, we can do it. We were just talking for half an hour just now about that, so I think we'll have plenty to say. So, Costas, could you kick this off and maybe give us an intro to the subject?
I would be happy to. So, as you so eloquently put in our opener, we are talking today about teaching Latin verb conjugations. And I think first we have to look at the different types of Latin verbs and how you would approach each one. So naturally, you would begin by talking about the regular Latin verbs. Well,
those are the ones I like.
Yeah, those are the ones everyone likes.
Why aren't they all just regular?
Well, and call me cynical, but I think there was a conspiracy when these languages started where, certain high-powered, important people got together around a table, maybe made of wood or stone or something, and said, we just can't make this easy for everyone. So we're going to have a certain number of rules and irregularities in our language that make it unique to us. And if people can't learn that, well, that's just too bad.
Well, I think you and a million Latin 1 students probably agree with each other.
I would say so, yes.
But if verbs are not regular, then what are they?
Well, naturally, they would be irregular.
Yeah. So those are the ones I like a little bit less because, how do you even know? How do you even learn on the irregular verb forms? If you need to conjugate an irregular verb, I can kind of see how you can do it with regular verbs, but irregular verbs, that seems impossible to me.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up because really I have found that the best way to teach irregular verbs is simply to take each verb for what it is on its own and learn it to perfection, inside out, back to front, and just study the word itself rather than worrying about patterns developing so much. Although that's not to say, of course, that you ignore what's going on with the verb. And for as many irregularities as exist in the irregular field, and this might sound kind of strange, but you can almost see a pattern developing somewhere. So, of course, the preeminent irregular Latin verb is sum, naturally, sum esse fui. But even within that, we can see the regular endings are on the end of that verb. Now, I do not recommend that you teach it that way, however. I find that would be confusing to the student, and as a matter of fact, I have experienced that it is confusing to the student. So in my own estimation, it's a good idea to take the word just for what it is. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that a lot of teachers, and often this is because maybe they learned Latin at the college level, they were taught in that the way you're talking about, where the teacher just is picking apart every single word and talking about the origin of the word, and this is how the word is put together. And I think that a lot of the time there's far too much focus on that, and it actually makes it much more difficult for students to learn. I in fact think that a lot of the details of the language, these are things students will learn, but they don't need to learn them in the beginning. Those things will come later. The important thing is that at each step, you are teaching the student exactly what he or she has to know at that stage. what's absolutely necessary. And I really try to leave out anything that's confusing or unnecessary. And I agree with you when it comes to irregular verbs. Just start conjugating them right like that. Sum es est. Sumus esti sunt. The students learn that really quickly, and they do not need to have it picked apart. You know, that sum ends in M, that es ends in S, et cetera, because then they ask, well, but the parts of the word that come before that, there's no regularity there. What's happening? Yeah, that's for later on in their Latin careers. I totally agree with you, Kostas.
And I just want to make mention of something. You made an excellent point, and I feel it really does need to be echoed. Because as Latin teachers, I think a lot of times we have a tendency to want to provide maybe more information than the student is ready for. We have maybe it's just me, I don't know, but I have trouble sometimes sort of tempering myself in what I want to offer the student when I'm first presenting something. And maybe I'll give them a little too much, or I won't have enough restraint necessarily to know that this is not vital information to where they are at this point. That doesn't mean, of course, that doesn't change down the road, but for where they're learning right now, there's only a certain amount of information that they need. And that will, of course, in turn facilitate things when they get further along.
Mm-hmm. They're learning an enormous amount all at once.
Yeah.
And it's vitally important that teachers be able to empathize with that. And I think, unfortunately, some teachers have a hard time with that, with putting themselves in the position of the student. But almost every student is going to be kind of overwhelmed when learning Latin. That's just normal, especially early on. So I really feel it's the job of the teacher to simplify it. As Thoreau said, I don't know that he was talking about Latin. I think he was talking about something else, but
probably, yeah.
It applies to Latin. Right, we've got regular and irregular verbs, and obviously when it comes to irregular verbs, you just want to go straight into the conjugating, but regular verbs are different, right, Kostas?
They are different because, of course, regular verbs are regular for a reason. They have regular endings, and this is where you get your handy-dandy personal endings, and there's a little, I know that this was interesting when we were talking before the show because, of course, we were reciting the endings as we are wont to do on occasion when there's nothing else to do. We'll just sit here reciting Latin personal endings. You've all done it, I'm sure.
On a Friday night, just do that for hours. Instead of going out and going to a party or whatever people do, I will just sit at home and recite those verb endings because I enjoy it so much.
I'm thinking of setting it to music and releasing an album. Maybe down the line, that would be something worth doing. I don't know.
I would buy that album.
Great background music, or use it as a coaster on your coffee table for any other purpose. That's fine. Anyhow, what I was saying was, I noticed you were saying the endings, and you say ost, mustis, int, right?
Yeah, I know I have a disagreement. So I don't like NT for what
okay. Let's debate the merits of this now.
Okay. I will tell you why. Now, this is a very minute point, so we probably shouldn't go on and on about this. But the long and short of it is I prefer nt because I always want students to be learning the sounds. I don't want them to be saying English letters. Right from the beginning, I want it to be about sound because, and I have taught students who have had Latin before, and I have noticed that this actually last week I had this experience, but it's not the first time. Teachers will sometimes teach students to not say the ending sounds, but to actually recite the English letters in the endings.
Oh, no.
I think that is so wrong.
That's horrific.
It is.
No
Well,
offense to any of you who do that, but please, if you do, stop at once.
yeah, I'm not exactly certain what the logic is there, but what happens is then the students don't learn the sounds. So I had a student, and we were going over the third declension, masculine, feminine, regular endings, and I said to her, okay, this is how you do it. You say blank is ema, ace ibus, ace ibus. She said, oh, that's not how we've done it. We do it isime, esum, ibus, esibus.
See, I wouldn't even know what to do with that.
I'm not making this up. And that's not the only student I've actually heard do that, or it can be a variation on that. Quite often, they'll say the letters for the singular and then actually say the sounds for the plural there. But I'm not certain what that's about. I'm sure that there are teachers who could probably, there's got to be a reason for that. But I just have to say that goes against everything I know about teaching Latin. But, I'm very much in favor of the oral approach in this, in having students recite things in a very precise way.
Mm-hmm. No, that's excellent reasoning. I honestly had not considered it that way. The way I learned it was, of course, to say NT, and the way I teach it also is to do that. And the reason I do it, having thought about it, is that, of course, you have the nice little rhyme you get to develop then, OST mustis senti, and you also have the correlation where you're bringing it back to that third-person singular, and then you finish with third-person plural. But your reasoning is quite sound, and you might have just convinced me.
Well, you have a really good point that if you do it your way, there's a real rhythm to it. Mm-hmm. No question. I really want students saying it the way it should be said right from the beginning. Mm-hmm. That's what I try. And then you could probably say, but Andrew, if it's OST, mustis, don't you mean it should be mustis?
That's true. Yeah.
So I guess, I'm not being totally consistent. It's true. So there is a point where I decide that, perhaps saying the letter makes sense. But we all need to make our own decisions about this. I think kind of the larger issues are the important thing. And then individual teachers may do things slightly differently. And that can all work just fine. Honestly, a lot of the time, I just kind of like the way things feel. And so that's how I do it.
That's good. No, that's a good thing. Anyhow, did not mean to belabor that, but thought it was an interesting point of possible contention. We have so few. So
Right. So and we want to talk next about maybe the steps. So you're going over the first one. So drilling the final verb endings. But let's take a short break for a message, and we'll be back in a minute.
We know that many Latin teachers out there would like to learn to speak the Latin language and to be trained in teaching conversational Latin, but they just haven't had the opportunity to develop these skills. If this describes you, please consider attending the Gray Fox Conversational Latin Workshop. These classes are open to all current, former, or prospective Latin teachers and are held live online through Skype. We even provide professional development credits for all attendees. The workshop classes are held weekly and are an hour long. Teachers can start at any time. For more information on class times or to register for our Conversational Latin Workshop, please email us at info@grayfoxtutors.com. That's info@grayfoxtutors.com. We hope to see you there.
Okay, we're back. So, Kostas, you were talking about the steps for teaching regular verb conjugations, and you'd started to talk about the first step. Maybe you could recap that.
Certainly. So, yes, this actually is a very good segue too. We were talking about how we actually say orally the endings, the personal endings, O or M, ST, mus, tis, and either nt or NT. And in terms of how you do this for your students now, these are the final verb endings that you must teach them naturally. You must present them to the students. And a good way to do that is to say them and have a visual representation as you're doing it. So if you have something on your chalkboard or you have a whiteboard or whatever it is, something being projected, if they're following along on their books or their tablets or whatever, as long as there's some sort of visual representation while they're speaking it, while they're hearing it. You want to get all the senses going all at one time. When you're initially doing this is, of course. And that's the teaching part of it. But the part that is equally important to that is the drilling that must come after that. You must drill these endings with the students. So it's not simply enough to go over them once or twice and then say, here, study these on your own. No, you must drill them consistently. Consistency is the name of the game with the students.
Yeah, and what I do, and I think this is probably pretty common, is I always start out with the visual there, and the students follow along, and then we transition into not having the visual anymore. Normally what I do is I have the students open their books up and look at the page where they see OST, mustisant, or however you say it. And for a while, we go over it and they look at the book, and then there's a point where I say, okay, I want all of you to put your hand over it so you can't see it, and try to do it without looking. If you absolutely cannot, quickly pick your hand up and then cover it up again. And that I found is a really good way to transition from looking to not looking. And they do that for a little bit, and then they don't need to look anymore. Then they've got it. And in fact, they've usually got it pretty much forever at that point. It's amazing how quickly these things can be taught.
Yeah.
So lots of drilling of those final 6 verb endings. What's step number 2, Kostas?
So then we talk about specific tense endings that are involved. And of course, we're talking about when there are tense signs paired up with those personal endings, namely the imperfect tense, the future tense. But of course, back to the imperfect really quickly. Bam, ba, spat, bamos, bati, spant. You need to impress that upon the student in the same way that you would do simply the regular endings, the personal endings. Or if it's future, naturally, bobi, spit, bimus, bitis, bunt.
Or, obviously, if it's third or fourth conjugation, es, ate, amus, atis, ain't. Whatever. But right, those final portions, the larger ending on the verbs. And so the same thing applies. You just start off by looking at it and then transition into not looking. But I would say it's very important that not only the students be looking at the visual, but they also be imitating the teacher.
Yes.
Orally. So the teacher says it, they say it. The visual is not enough. They need to hear those sounds and imitate those sounds. What's the third step for this?
Well, then you're ready to conjugate. And so you, again, show them how it's done for each of the different conjugations for example verbs. And again, very important to note that you not only teach this, but you must drill it. It must be impressed upon the students so that they have plenty of time to practice it, plenty of time to hear themselves say it, hear you say it, and repeat it.
Yeah. So again, the oral is so important here. It is important to start off with that visual and for the students to maintain that visual in their minds, I think. But then you've got to have that oral work, and it's extremely important that the teacher do it first. So when I'm teaching conjugations, let's say it's laudo, laudare, and we're doing the present. Well, I will start by saying it. I'll say laudo, laudas, laudat, laudamus, laudatis, laudant. And I'll say, okay, students or student, why don't you do that? And they'll go laudo, laudas, laudat, laudamus, laudatis, laudant. And I'll say, okay, that was good, but it's more like this. Laudo, laudas, laudat, laudamus, laudatis, laudant. And in this case, it's just the accent. They're making a mistake in the accent, right. But quite frequently they may actually make a mistake in the pronunciation, or confuse one word with another. But the way that gets corrected most effectively is through imitation of the teacher. So it's extremely important that the teacher be able to do it correctly.
Yes, ideally, yes, that would be helpful.
Right. And so I only say this because I've encountered quite a few teachers who don't necessarily know how to do that. And it's not their fault. It's just that's how they were taught. Yeah. To not, in particular, not learn the accents of words.
And especially when we get into the specific tense endings also, it seems to be a bit harder in those particular forms.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's not, it's very difficult to actually learn this effectively without just doing it over and over, imitating someone who knows it. You can, and I say teachers should definitely be teaching students the rules of accent. Absolutely. That should be taught. That should be taught right in the beginning, and teachers should keep going over it to make sure that students know that extremely well, because they need that as a backup when the teacher isn't there and they need to figure it out on their own. But it's almost impossible for students to learn how to say words efficiently and effectively without imitating. So I just want to push that. I don't want to go on and on about it forever.
No, it's absolutely true. Let me back you up really quickly. When I was learning French in college, I should say I tried to learn French on my own. And this was before college, when I was in high school. And I just knew that there was something missing from my education of this. I mean, I could read all the books I wanted. I could listen to all the tapes I wanted. It just wasn't happening for me. And I said, the one component that's missing here is I need to get in front of a real live French person and hear them. Doesn't necessarily, I guess, have to be an actual French person, but that's helpful. And we had one at the university, which was good. And I said, that will make all the difference. I'll be able to hear the language as it really is, the way it's supposed to be used. And one summer, I just took a bunch of French classes, and that made all the difference. Mm-hmm. So why not the same with Latin? It should be.
Oh, well, absolutely. And I think this, we'll talk about this at the end, but clearly the way you use a language is vital when it comes to actually learning that language. You cannot separate learning from use. These are things that have to happen simultaneously. And obviously, in the beginning, you're maybe not going to use it that well, but you need to do it. You need to actually use the language as a language. That's definitely my belief. That's been my experience. But again, I don't want to go on and on, because I know, Kostas, you've got some comments about maybe important aspects of teaching the conjugations.
Yes, so this is going to play right into what we were just talking about, and what we talk about quite frequently is that the first thing that you want to note is that there should be oral conjugation going on. So, of course, that does not simply mean having the student look in their book at how it's written out in the paradigm, but this is done in concert with, again, speaking it, reciting it, having it said back to you. The student gets to hear it. The student speaks it. There's a synergy going on. The oral component is so very important. Especially, of course, as we've said, when you're teaching and then drilling the endings, teaching and drilling the tense endings, teaching and drilling the conjugations, and then you want to do the same when you go through any number of random verbs that belong to those conjugations.
Well, okay, so I'm going to be devil's advocate here and mention something that I've heard some teachers say, and there's certainly a point here. At some schools, I know there is a tendency to direct students who have maybe oral skills that aren't as good as other students to Latin. Because then, depending on how it's taught, they may not have to deal with speaking the language
Yes.
in that case. What do you think about that, Kostas?
I am not a proponent of that, and that does not fly in a class of mine. If you're in a class of mine and we're doing Latin, you're going to speak, and that's just the way that it is. I do not consider Latin to be a language in which you can hide yourself. That is not the way that I approach the language, and I find that when you confine yourself to it in that way, you never, ever really get the full breadth and depth of the language. You might become pretty good at doing that, but you'll never get the full experience that way, and there'll be a lot you're missing out on. And I just find that it's far more effective for the student when you do it with the spoken component as part of your instruction.
Well, I have a slightly different opinion about that. Clearly, there are students who have learning disabilities, and it may be very difficult for them to speak a language.
Sure.
And, I say if there are classes, I really think that it's fine to have classes for, Latin classes for those students where maybe there is not much of an oral component, although it's almost impossible not to have any oral component at all. I mean, I'm not sure how that's managed. But I guess maybe it could be done, and maybe it has been. I think that that's okay if there is a feeling that it's just going to be too difficult for the students to handle that. But I would say that that's a very small percentage of students.
I would too, and yeah. If that's really, if you're insistent upon that, or that's the way that it has to be, then so be it. Okay, but that's not the way I do things. But
but I would say that the issue is that there's this tendency to treat this in a black and white way.
Right.
So the attitude sometimes is, well, because there are students who have a hard time with the oral aspect of a language, then let's just make Latin the non-oral language, and let's make it so that nobody treats it in that way.
Right. Yeah, I don't like that at all.
This is what happens at quite a few schools, and I don't quite understand that logic. I really think, in my mind, well, just do that with French instead.
Yeah.
And make that non-oral, and we'll just make Latin the oral one. When you think about it, if you really, you have to have decided already that Latin is not really a language in the way other languages are languages, to decide, well, Latin has to be the one you don't speak.
Well, you're making my point, and I was just going to say again, I think this goes back to the idea that we're doing this because this is the way it's always been done. Of course, this is not the way it's always been done, but that's our frame of reference. We can only go back so far, and so we say, well, this is how it was taught to us, and this is how our teacher was taught, and this is how their teacher was taught, and all of this. Of course, this is not how people were taught, a couple hundred years before that, but this is the idea that persists, that, well, it's always been done this way. This is how it must be.
Yeah, and I think what I'm advocating is for people to just get out of their comfort zone a little bit.
Absolutely.
And, when I say, um, hey, I think it's okay for there to be non-oral Latin classes, then I'm getting a little bit out of, away from how I normally do things. But I don't think that shouldn't exist. But as I said, at the same time, I think it would make just as much sense to teach Spanish or French without speaking it. That there's no reason that Latin should be the one that isn't spoken. In fact, I think there are very good arguments for why Latin is probably the one that has to be spoken of those, because it requires, it's different enough from the modern languages that it really needs, that oral practice is needed for the students. Yeah. They need to really be using that language a lot in a rapid way. And that's what speaking the language does. But anyway, I'm going on and on. Let's go on to the next thing here. Another important aspect is pattern recognition. And we talked about that. And as I said before, this is something that is done best with verb charts. And I just want to say that we have in the archives section of the Gray Fox website, we have Latin verb charts for both regular and irregular verbs. And we've got all the big irregular verbs there. And then for the regular ones, we have just example verbs for each one. Then what's the next maybe important aspect, would you say?
Well, naturally, we've spoken about, of course, how important it is to be pronouncing things and accenting things correctly. And we want to make sure that the student is grasping that and doing it properly. So the student should be imitating the teacher in that regard. And you want to nip those problems right in the bud, because I have found out the hard way that when students come in sometimes and they come for tutoring and they're already kind of in a set mode with certain things, maybe they've been saying something a certain way for a year or so, it's a lot more difficult to get them out of that bad habit then. So that's something you want to nip in the bud immediately.
Mm-hmm. And then the next step in teaching these things for me is random Latin to English and English to Latin oral testing of verb forms. That's a mouthful, but what that means is I will say a verb form, and then the student will need to give me the English translation of that. And I'll do that for a bit. And then as soon as possible, I'll move over to English to Latin, where I say the English, and then the students need to say the Latin. And I, in fact, spend much more time on that. I focus much more on that because I've seen how much more helpful English to Latin is than Latin to English.
Yeah, that's very important too, absolutely. And that's something that I used to give on homework assignments when I was teaching at university. I did not do it orally at that time, but I have, of course, come to appreciate and understand how important it is to be able to do that orally. And now I do that. And it's very vital to the students' learning. So that's an excellent thing that should be part of your teaching.
And then we got maybe a last stage here. What would that be, Hostess?
Well, that's when we bring it all together and we say, well, let's put it into practice, so to speak. So you've got your written sentences and your translation and your composition exercises. So naturally, you want the student to be able to recognize what's there and how to properly deal with it and work with it. Of course, the written component, as I just said, but also the conversational context in speaking. You want the student to be able to use the correct conjugation of verbs in whatever they are saying.
Mm-hmm. Now, there are a lot of teachers who are not, when it comes to speaking the Latin language, there are a lot of teachers who don't like to do that. Right. And then there's a certain number of teachers who would like to, but just can't. They never learned to do it themselves. I would just say that, like a lot of things, it's something you just have to do to understand how positive it is in terms of learning.
It truly is a game-changing experience. It really is.
Yeah, and I know we come back to this a lot, but we do because my experience of Latin was changed by moving into conversation. I went from a struggling student to somebody who really had achieved real fluency in the language just by actually starting to speak the language. And so I understand that most Latin teachers did not learn that way. And in fact, I don't advocate, just learning by speaking it. I advocate learning the grammar and then simultaneously using it conversationally. But, that's how I think every language should be learned.
Yeah, no, we do it because we believe so strongly in it. And as you said, for your experience and my experience was to actually have it occur in my formative years of Latin, which is a little different, I know, but we've come to the same place ultimately, and we understand the importance of this.
Yeah, and I just want to say neither of us is a fanatic, and unfortunately, and this is kind of an odd thing to say because we're talking about a pretty small group of people, but unfortunately, among Latin teachers, there are these odd kind of cliques that develop. So maybe on the one hand, no, we don't want any sort of, or just kind of minimum oral use of the language. And then on the other hand, there are people who say, well, no, you need to teach Latin 100% orally, speaking it, just only speaking it from the beginning. You learn it by speaking it. I think that there's a lot that's in fact positive in both of those viewpoints. For me, it's about results. So I've tried a number of different things. And what I want is for every student in the class to learn the Latin language effectively and be in a position to actually, if he or she wants to continue to, in a certain number of years, really become fluent in the language. And I know that there are some teachers who kind of scoff at that. Fluency, what? That's impossible. But it's not. And if the goal is for students, and I know for a lot of teachers, they say, well, the goal is so the students can read these classics. Well, if that's the goal, then they do need to achieve real fluency in the language. You cannot read a text rapidly unless you have achieved real fluency in the language. And I have seen from experience that not just the quickest way to get to that, but maybe the only way to get there is by using Latin as a spoken language and practicing it a lot conversationally.
Yeah. Well, there's the misconception that exists, of course, that somehow spoken Latin will detract from the ability to use it in a more traditional manner in translation, and that just couldn't be further from the truth.
No, I mean, these things go together.
Right.
As I said, I think that grammar and conversation are things that should be done side by side. And I think it's a tremendous shame how often grammar is neglected in teaching modern languages. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because when you go in that direction, you also make it impossible for the student to become fluent in the language. I mean, maybe the student can speak the language to a degree, but it'll always be a broken version of the language. Yeah. Because this wonderful shortcut of grammar has been eliminated. This thing that makes it so much easier to deal with a language is eliminated. So again, I'm not a fanatic. You're not a fanatic. We've just tried different things, and we do what we do because we've seen that these are the things that work best. Maybe somebody's going to come in and show me that there's something big I've been missing. That's entirely possible. And I really welcome that person because
I would like to see
want to
this.
get better. So we'll see.
Anyhow, yeah. Well, it looks like we've just about reached the end of our time here today. And as always, if you have enjoyed what you've heard, please subscribe to our podcast. We do this every week. We have all sorts of interesting topics that we have discussed and we still have yet to discuss for all of your potential issues or discussion topics that you might want to hear something about. And as always, let me also remind you, of course, to please check out and download the materials that we spoke of today that are in the Gray Fox archives on the Gray Fox website. For today, that would be the Latin regular verb conjugations as well as the irregular verb conjugation charts. So please take a look at those if you have not already. And that's just about it for us today. So Andrew, thank you so much again. It's been a pleasure, as always.
Thank you so much, Kostas. Pleasure for me as well.
Okay, and we will see you all again next time on the Gray Fox Latin Teacher Podcast. Bye-bye.
Vale.